Hello there, and thanks, Ella, for my introduction. I'd just like to start by saying thanks very much for asking me to speak at the event, and I haven't seen the lineup of speakers over the few days. I hope I have something to offer to those of you watching. My name is Robert Brewster, and for a few years now, I've been developing a system of grazing my cattle in the most unusual manner, but with a view to building soil carbon in the way that we graze our animals. And we're certainly having developed it over about 10 years period, we're certainly starting to see the benefits of it now. But I must say that none of these ideas are my own, and most of my ideas have been stolen from a vast number of people. So I owe a great deal of credit to graziers that I followed online, books that I've read by a great number of cattle and soil people from both in the United Kingdom and overseas. Some of the ideas have been taken from people in the current era to soil champions that lived 50 to even 100 years ago and wrote about their observations. Everyone trying to adopt regenerative farming techniques have a different starting point. And I was very lucky that my parents had an interest in organics and soils for a long time. So they really gave me a leapfrog ahead as to compare to where a lot of people have started from. So without further ado, I'll get cracking and tell you a bit about myself and what I get up to. Here's the content of what I'll be talking about to you today. I've just noticed that I've not mentioned livestock numbers. We run roughly 200 organic Aberdeen Angus cross Hereford breeding cows, selling a mixture of finished and store animals depending on forage supply. We also have about 100 easy care sheep that aren't run in a mob grazing system, but I like to refer to them as the ragwort patrol. The photograph, if it's coming up all right, was taken in a February time when we were bale grazing, and the cattle were moving from one field to another through an awkward gateway. So it was quite a handy photo, I thought, to show the girls on the move. The farm, if you look here, we'll start by looking at the farm. We're up in Angus on the east coast of Scotland, about 10 miles north of Dundee, nestled in a glen in the Sidlaw Hill Range. We have quite a mixture of land type, as the farm runs from Heather Hill right down to land suitable for arable crops, although still slightly marginal. It's further up the valley from the prime arable land in the area. But the majority of the land is upland that my grandfather reclaimed from hill. Most of the land is free draining as it is ground that either slopes uphill, and if it doesn't slope uphill, it slopes downhill. Traditionally, the farm was typical to most farms in the area, where we had both a mixture of livestock, both sheep and cattle, and cereals. But where most farms in our area have moved away from livestock and to more cereal-based farming, we have done the opposite, moving away from cereal and reducing the sheep numbers to really concentrate on the cattle enterprise. My parents were early adopters of organics, producing both organic cereals and veg, with the first land going into organics in the 1980s, and the rest of the land converting to organic somewhere around the year 2000. I was the last person to spread synthetic fertilizer on the farm as a teenager, and I remember it well because the tractor had a faulty fuel gauge, and I ended up running out of fuel when I was spreading fertilizer on one of the braes. Nowadays, we run a fairly low-tech, high biological farming system, kind of try to sell as much as the machinery we could have associated with the cereal growing days. I'm pretty happy with the way that most things are done on the farm just now, but it's taken quite a bit of trial and error to get to this stage, and taking quite a leap of faith into mob grazing and the style of regenerative farming I feel we need to practice as an industry. Growing up, I thought organic farming was fairly mainstream, as it was really the only farming I knew, because by the time I was a teenager and taking an interest in farming, the farm was fully organic, and Dad really instilled on me the importance of grassland, clover, and farmyard manure as the main drivers of soil health. A lot of my farming confusion probably happened when I went away to agricultural college. And after meeting my wife, Kathleen, in the first 6 months of college, I decided to drag my studies out to 4 years to get an honours degree. And as I quite enjoyed bumming around Edinburgh, and looking back, I probably could have squeezed my college learning into 2 years or maybe even 1 year. Like most young men, I left college knowing absolutely everything there was to know about farming. It was just a shame the farming I learned about was the high output post-war farming where yield was king at all costs and soil was simply something to stand a plant up in while you applied the recommended NP and K. I left college thinking to farm I needed Limousin cattle, we needed a silage pit to feed a TMR, and the only grass there was ryegrass. Luckily, my dad didn't give in to my demands of a complete farming upheaval, and eventually and very gradually I started reading from less obvious sources of farming literature. And in 2010, I started playing about moving yearling cattle behind an electric fence after reading Andre Vasson's book, Grass Productivity. It was quite confusing to start with, as I had no idea what I was doing and unknowingly dabbling between two different grazing methods, the take all ryegrass New Zealand model and the waste lots of grass American sort of mob grazing or holistic style. One of the big breakthroughs came in 2014 when I made the 1,000-mile round trip to the Oxford Real Farming Conference and heard a few British direct drilling experts talking about soil in a way that was just far more than just NP and K, and with an interest in pH. And the way they spoke of soil was far more as if it was a living medium, and they spoke about soil almost the way you'd hear an organic gardener speaking about soil, with respect to the soil complexity, with the emphasis on organic matter or soil carbon as the foundation of soil health. Around this time, I started learning about Alan Savory and his take on grazing, inspired by nature's huge migrating herds. And around about this time, I had a chance meeting with an Australian savory type grazer who came out to our farm for a few days and recommended that we adopt a system where we have one large mob of cattle instead of lots of small groups, and this would allow us to greatly increase the rest periods between grazing intervals. This idea was a bit extreme for us at the time, but it was exactly what we've worked towards over the years. And at this point, maybe my emphasis moved from seeing the farm as a production-based system to almost seeing the farm as an ecosystem that has the ability to support a whole host of life, from the soil right up into all the wildlife and birds and plants. And it's far more complex than I've maybe ever given it credit for before. I can't claim to be a soil expert, but the way I see soil is it's a hugely complex subject with all sorts of things, a balancing act. But whether you look at the chemical, physical, or biological side of it, everything can be gradually improved by building soil organic matter or soil carbon. Through mob grazing, I feel we can really improve all sorts of soil problems through slow and steady increases in soil organic matter. Through growing far more grass on the surface and therefore applying more manure out of the back end of the cows, we're growing much more vigorous root mass. And I really feel we're seeing much better water holding capacity in this soil, with much less poaching in wet weather and much more resilience in dry periods. I feel there's a very subtle difference between mainstream agricultural thinking, regardless whether it's organic and conventional, and the thinking behind mob grazing or regenerative farming practices. And it takes a bit of a leap of faith in order to change how you see soil. I think conventional farming views soil as a system where healthy soil grows healthy plants, whereas I actually think mob grazing or a regenerative mindset shows that it's actually healthy plants that grow healthy soil. And what we're trying to do is maximize the process of photosynthesis to kickstart soil health. And although photosynthesis maybe can't solve all soil issues, it can give it it gives it a good go through building the soil organic matter through the mob grazing. We've certainly alleviated all sorts of soil issues. I think the term mob grazing means a lot of different things to different people. To me, it really means moving cattle to a fresh area of grass every day through the use of portable fences and water troughs in order to build soil fertility. And we look to move cattle with an electric fence 365 days of the year to a new area. I think when it was new to the UK a few years ago, we all got hung up on trying to trample vast quantities of grass onto the soil surface. But I think now it is generally accepted that this isn't necessary in our climate, and actually it's the roots that build soil organic matter more than leaving residues trampled on the soil surface. And actually, we found it very hard to get animals to perform under a system where we're trying to trample vast quantities of grass. Interestingly enough, this photo, the bottom photo of the farm, was taken a few years ago, and this field no longer has buttercups in it, as the soil profile has opened up with the deeper roots and has helped to aerate the soil. I'm going to jump ahead a bit, but I'll explain in a minute. I'll explain more in a minute, but I'm a bit short of summer photos. In the bottom photo of the farm, it gives a good example of how the farm's all divided up into 100-meter wide alleys, and the cattle graze up and down the alleyways continuously. We just need to move temporary electric fence, like rungs on a ladder, to join the steel fences up with polywire. Where the cattle are there, we'll have two front fences, two front fences, one for tomorrow's, to give them tomorrow's, or to contain them where they are today, and a second fence so that they get moved into tomorrow's block. And it's also handy to have two fences always ahead of them in case they break out of one fence, which can happen occasionally. Our grazing technique has probably changed a bit since then, as in the summertime like that, the cattle would move quicker now, where we wouldn't be forcing them to graze as much, as the general rule is the faster the grass growth, the faster the rotation of the animals, and the slower the grass growth, the slower the rotation of the animals. So generally speaking, we need far fewer paddocks larger paddocks in the summertime when the grass is at peak growth, and lots of smaller paddocks in the wintertime when the grass is slowed down growth. And we've really looked in the wintertime to almost harvest as much as we possibly can. This is a very anecdotal observation as to what I've seen happen in the farm over the last 10 or even 5 years, especially as we haven't adopted these systems. My problem is it's completely anecdotal, and I don't have much to prove it other than my observations. But I'm hoping to do more soil tests in the future and compare them to historical soil tests to see how the organic matter on the farm has improved. But the soils are definitely it's not just the soils, but actually the sward and the grass. It's almost like the grass is determined to grow for probably about 8 or 9 months of the year, whereas in the old set stock system, the grass would really have stopped growing by August, and then it would just be fairly mottled looking sward, with some parts of the sward animals wouldn't touch because they're near dung pats or urine, not so much urine, but dung pats, with bare patches about water troughs and gateways, whereas now it's almost as if the farm is a sea of green, and the grass wants to grow. With grass grows right up to gateways and right up to any permanent features like rocks or even telegraph poles where animals used to gather and rub and gather around them for a prolonged period of time. Whereas now, because the animals only have access to a gateway where they used to mill, or an electric pole that they used to rub, they only have access to that for one day at a time. The grass grows everywhere there. There's definitely been, the soils are far more biologically active with an increase of plant diversity and wildlife. As said before, with insects, birds, and this year especially, there's been a huge abundance of fungi in areas that I've never seen fungi in my living memory. Fields that were maybe even plowed, or maybe even in potatoes 10 years ago, there's fungi appeared there now, which I'm quite excited about. That it's very hard to quantify or put a number against that sort of thing, other than say, give an opposite, tell anecdotally what I've seen changes on the farm. Here's a fairly crude diagram to show the different forages we rely on at different times of the year, with the main milestones at the bottom. I'll start with the calving season because I think that's the most important part of the whole system. We calve from this beginning in May through to the end of June. We did have calving down to a 6-week period, but I actually think for the sake of getting a few more cows in calve, it's better at 8 weeks. We used to calve from the middle of March onwards, and this would work well in a good spring. But when there was an abundance of forage, and when we had a late spring, we could really get into a bit of a forage shortage when the cows needed good grass in front of them and it wasn't there. We also can get fairly wild, stormy snow in March and even April, and I got fed up digging newborn calves out of snowdrifts. And I remember reading either a Joel Salatin book or a Greg Judy book, and they mentioned that you should calve when the local ruminants give birth in your area. So for us, that's the roe deer, which tend to give birth in May and June time. It's really a case of trying to farm the way nature intended, and the more we can get out of the way and leave nature to its own devices, the more things seem to click into place. And it's I think it's a pretty strong indicator as to when we should calve, when calves are born with a summer coat and not a winter coat. The fact that we calve in May and June means that our cow's winter requirements are far less than a cow that gives birth in winter or early spring. Cow fertility is also dictated by the condition the cow calves in, and not the condition the cows are bulled in, from my understanding. So we really try to pamper the cows for a month, 6 weeks pre-calving, and they can really put on condition quickly at that time of year. Cow fertility is also heavily influenced by the time of year, or the day length, as the closer a cow calves to the longest day of the year, the quicker she's likely to get back and calve. We try to sell as much stock as we can from August, September, and October time, so we can get as many mouths off of the farm pre-winter with winter being really a maintenance diet, in the summer about maximizing the kilograms gained on the animals. We can usually run cattle on stockpiled forage in October, November, December through to maybe even February, where they go on to the bale grazing system, and then April and May onto grazed grass. For a couple of years now, we experimented direct drilling forage rye into grass, sowing the rye maybe mid-September time when the grass's growth is slowing down, with the idea that the forage rye will come away from the grass as it grows quite well. And if you get a good spring, the forage rye will grow quite well in March, April time, and it'll really explode out of the ground. And I've experimented with it a little bit. I'll speak about it more later on, but it was seen as a way of kind of almost bringing the forage growth forward a month, if you know what I mean, earlier in the year, forage quantity. But there's definitely potential there to make it work. And I've done a little bit of experimenting, but I've probably need to try and develop a little bit more, but I've not actually tried it this year. For maybe 5 or 6 years now, we've managed to drastically reduce our silage needs by feeding stockpile, or deferred grazing as it's sometimes called. This is really where cocksfoot comes into its own. And I first read about this technique in the Clifton Park farming system, written in 1885. The author, Robert Henry Elliott, referred to it as foggish farming, and he claimed the hooves impacting the soil surface while feeding out the standing hay was the best way to get rid of moss in the sward. We've certainly found this to be the case, and now the only place we see moss is where the cattle hooves don't touch, such as down the side of a dike or beneath the permanent electric dividing fence. Sometimes we can poach a little bit too much on a wet weather period, shown down on the bottom right here, but as long as the cattle are only there one day during this poaching event and they're in their back fence, it's amazing how the grass actually bounces back from this, what looks like a severe poaching. As you can see on the bottom right, this photo was taken about a month after it was quite severely poached, and the cocksfoot in January was even quite determined to grow at that time of year. And usually we try to feed out all the stockpile before going on to silage, but some years we thought we'd go on to bales sooner to try and keep some of this grass, or sort of standing hay, to feed even in sort of March, April time, or April time when the grass is starting to grow again. It's good to have that dead fibre throughout the lush grass to help balance the forage on offer, and it means that the dung doesn't get too loose with the animals grazing lush spring grass. What we've done, or what we tend to do, is we feed this with oat straw. So there's always a trailed feeder with oat straw on offer to balance, or to give the cattle a bit more fill. But actually, in wet weather, if the grass is wet, it can actually get too loose in the animals. So we try and balance the straw with the grass. Here's a few photos of the bale grazing that I was talking about earlier. What we tend to do is we round silage bales made in the field, and they're just left in the field more or less exactly where they come out of the baler wrapper, and they're sat on their ends because they keep far better. And then they get double wrapped as well in order to prevent damage from crows and even pheasants pecking on the bales. And then we graze up. Well, first of all, what we do is we go into the field with a tractor and a quad bike and trailer and remove all the plastic and all the net from the bales, and graze as we would in the summertime. The cows move up a lane while being back fenced with a portable water trough. And we used to do this, or a similar system to this, with ring feeders. However, what we found is the ring feeders, although they maybe you make better use of the bale, or you waste less of the bale. There's actually more poaching with ring feeders because the cattle tend to bore into the ring feeder and dig with their front feet. But without using a ring feeder, I think we only waste about, it's hard to put a figure to it, but it can't be any more than 5% of a silage bale gets wasted in dry weather. And it means that's what the other change we've done is we used to, I didn't like to bring the tractor into the field at all. So it cut the bale, leaving a disc of plastic on the ground, which would get removed the following day. However, you'd be digging sort of through the mud to try and find all the plastic. And I actually came to the conclusion it's far easier to bring a tractor into the field in order to remove all the plastic. And as long as the tractor is driving where the cattle haven't yet been on the standing grass, then the ground holds the tractor reasonably well. But if you drive the tractor over the ground where the cattle have been in the previous few days or even the previous month, where the cattle have been in the winter, there is a bit more soil damage. So again, the secret to this system is to have the cattle constantly on the move, as they would be in the summertime, where we front fence and back fence, and the temporary infrastructure with the fences and the water trough allow us to do this. But obviously, can get challenging, and probably the most tricky times to make this work is in severely wet weather. And also, another one of the secrets is probably to have far less. You don't want to do this with lots of silage bales in one lane or in one area. You're better probably spreading your silage crop over 3 times the area, so the cattle are moving through an area far quicker than if there was a lot of silage bales. They'd be held in the one area for quite a long time, and that's when you get into poaching. One of the big investments on the farm, but it was actually a great thing to do, was to upgrade the watering system by burying a 50 mil pipe all the way through the farm with it's got a reducing 25 mil tees that I plug into with a temporary water trough. And this is all fed off of a hill spring, which is absolutely brilliant. But there's some areas above the spring and above the settling tank that don't water so well. So the cattle have to come back to slightly lower ground to access drinking water. So that's the water system. This is the fencing. So laid over that same map at that same angle, the whole farm is divided into these 100-meter wide lanes, or roughly 100-meter wide lanes, that the cattle are constantly on the march up and down. It's a very efficient way in order to graze the cattle the way we do. And it means we can divide the whole farm up into hundreds, if not even thousands, of paddocks of variable size, depending on the size of the group. It's proven to be fairly cheap and easy, and it works well. And it would certainly work well if you're incorporating livestock into an arable setting. You could fit it around, say, tram lines, or even in an agroforestry system with hedges would be possibly the ultimate way to farm, with hedges along these fence lines, with cattle grazing up and down the lanes still. Mob grazing can be a very competitive environment for cattle, and you need to be very, very careful not to push the animals too hard. The 2 things you need to make sure is the cattle are kept fairly full by looking on the left side of the animal, just in front of its hip bone, and make sure that the dung or the cow pats are the right consistency. I like to think that the right consistency is like an Audi, a pile of muck with 4 rings on it. I think it's a similar ratio to making good compost, where you need to balance carbon to nitrogen, whereas a cow pat, we're balancing protein to energy. And I would consider supplementing with hay in the spring when the grass gets too lush. Although it's often, you would think if a cow is actually craving hay because of lush grass, they often don't wish to, you almost don't need to force them to eat it. You would think they would crave it and they'd find it themselves. A lot of people do a lot of measurements and calculations of dry matter and the requirements of the animals, but I think I don't do much on that side of things, because I think you do all those measurements and you still need to make sure through observation that the animals are well fed and content. So I don't bother with too much in the way of forage budgeting, if you like. If you're going to run cattle under a mob grazing system, we really need to start assessing cattle by their ability to graze and function on forage, instead of judging them by how pretty they look in the show ring one day of the year. You see here 2 bulls of the same breed, one bred for the show ring, another bred for a forage-based system, with the animal on the right being a well-known New Zealand Angus bull. The forage-based animal is shorter, thicker type with far greater rumen capacity. And as I often say to people, it's a shame that for the last 60 years we've been, as an industry, breeding the rumen off of our ruminants. I often get asked about the weight of our cattle, and this, although it's not totally irrelevant, I almost think it's more relevant to talk about the frame score, as these 2 bulls could be very well be identical weight, but the show ring bull stands possibly 6 inches taller than the bull on the right that's bred to run on forage. By correlating the weight with the frame score of an animal, you get an idea of the depth of the animal. And I've included here a frame score chart and an indication of frame scoring that was developed by I think it was Missouri University, in order to actually shrink animals, to make animals far bigger, but we can actually use the same frame scoring charts in order to make cattle smaller and thicker by correlating the frame score with the weight of the animal. I'm not suggesting that people go out and do this with all their animals, but it's quite a good indicator. If even you just do a handful of the herd, it gives you an idea of the thickness or the frame score related to the depth of the animal. A smaller framed animal will generally always be an easier fleshing animal, as they have a lower body maintenance and they can get their fill of grass much quicker when competing against bigger framed animals under a mob grazing system. Some grass-fed nations don't have to worry too much about carcass spec, but we need to be careful not to breed cattle too small if we're selling into abattoirs through conventional routes. I think Greg Judy's cattle work out about 400 kilograms live weight. And as much as I'd love to run cattle that size here, you'd have a job finding an abattoir to take them. Although if we were selling direct to the consumer, it wouldn't be such a problem. Some people struggle with the idea of smaller animals, but it's all about trying to increase the output per hectare, not output per animal. Arable farmers don't talk about output of grain per grain plant. They talk about output per hectare, and that's probably where we need to start thinking with the type of animals we breed. And another thing that I think it's quite similar to is almost comparing a dairying system with Holsteins to a dairying system, a forage-based dairying system is sort of on a kind of a Kiwi-based forage-based system, where the animals output per animal maybe isn't that high, but across the sort of output per hectare is higher, because you're having smaller animals that can utilize grass better. I spoke earlier about pasture cropping. Here's a few photographs of forage rye that has been direct drilled straight into grass sward without any chemicals or even any cultivation. And there's definitely it's definitely got potential to produce a lot of forage cheaply, and also not just cheap forage, but also to bring diversity and a different root structure into the soil, opening up the soil structure. The two photos on the bottom shows the forage on offer in early spring, and then in May time, the forage rye has the ability to jump to practically almost 6 foot in height. Well, definitely 6 foot in height, and it's a great scavenger of nitrogen as well. I'd just like to finish by sort of plugging a few books that I've really found beneficial over the years, and also share a few more photographs. And I'd like to just thank you again for having me speak to you today. And I hope it's been of interest, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions anyone has. Thank you.